All right, thank you everybody for joining our RVNUG meetup today. Excited to have all of you guys here. We are now a hybrid group, and we meet online and have face-to-face meetings. We try to do one per quarter, but sometimes we have the opportunity to do more. I'm going to let Alex mention a few things here after the intro, but just really excited to have both face-to-face and these online meetings. We have great speakers to you, both local and remote. And today is absolutely not an exception. We've got Isaac Levin giving a fantastic presentation on leveling up on GitHub, which is something that I've been wanting to do for a long time. So really excited to have you here with us, Isaac. So Isaac's going to be speaking on leveling up on GitHub. Isaac is a .NET developer advocate as well as a Microsoft MVP. He has over 10 years of experience working as a developer for the web, mostly in the Microsoft ecosystem. Outside of work, he hosts a podcast called Coffee and Open Source. That's an awesome name there, Isaac. I like that. I'm going to have to check that out. Coffee and Open Source. Where he interviews folks from across the tech industry, as well as builds open source projects like PresenceLight and GitHub Stat Tracker. Very cool. He lives outside of Seattle, Washington, and likes to wind down from work with his wife, Ariana, and his two children, Isaac and Avery. Thank you very much, Isaac, for joining us. Take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. I love chatting with the lovely folks of Virginia. So a little bit of inside baseball. My wife is from the East Coast. I've been to Virginia multiple times visiting family as well as going to weddings. So it's always really nice. Been to a couple of weddings in Leesburg. I know that's not the same area, but it's still Virginia, right? So thanks for hopping on. I know it's late over on the East Coast, and hopefully you'll get something out of this conversation. So my name is Isaac Levin. I'm like was mentioned, a .NET developer advocate as well as Microsoft MVP in the developer technology space. I also host a podcast, like was mentioned. If anybody's interested in the podcast, coffeeandopensource.com, where I interview folks all over the tech landscape. I've interviewed folks like Scott Hanselman and Kelsey Hightower, and probably a lot of names that you probably recognize if you're on tech social media. I've been doing it for 3 years, and I just love the conversation. So if you enjoy listening to people rant about technology for an hour, definitely check out that podcast. It's available on all streaming platforms as well. There's a live version on my YouTube channel. So I think one of the best things I love to introduce folks to when we talk about GitHub specifically is GitHub is not just a place to store code. And I think, a lot of folks probably think, oh, okay, well, there's other tools out there to do things like CI/CD or project management or so on and so forth. But you can actually do all these things inside of GitHub. And what I love about that opportunity is, as a developer, I don't want a context switch. I don't want to have to go from one place to another, make sure my auth is set up, make sure my integrations are set up. I just want to get my work done. And in a lot of cases, GitHub, you can do your entire development lifecycle inside of one tool or one set of tools. And I'd like to kind of show some of the cool things that you can do in GitHub that you might not have been aware of. And the first thing that I love to show is GitHub is a social media platform, our social networking platform. So like a Twitter or Mastodon or LinkedIn or what have you, it's a social network. And there's millions of developers on GitHub. And one way that I love to, be a bit different and show my real persona on GitHub is using a GitHub profile. If you're not familiar with that, everybody has one. If you just go to github.com/your GitHub alias, you can create an experience that looks like this. So again, this is just a little profile that I put together, and this is all in Markdown. So that's like the language of GitHub. What's really interesting about this particular profile is that I update it every 5 minutes. So I actually have a process that runs every 5 minutes to update this with, update my stars, update my forks, and so on and so forth. We can take a look at that if anybody's interested. But one of the cool things also about GitHub is that, you might not like being in white theme and light theme or is what you would call it. And I think one of the things that's really, really interesting about GitHub profile specifically is that you have the ability to fine tune how your profile looks depending on which theme you have. Like, so for instance, if this was just to be completely dark, the screen was going to completely black, all these icons and logos would look, honestly, they look terrible. But one of the cool things you can actually, depending on your theme, you can actually change the particular icons that show. And I can actually show you what that looks like. If I go into my settings of my GitHub profile and I go to appearance, and I'm going to go and just change this to dark default, I'm going to go back to my profile. So immediately what happens is that all of the icons that I have changed a different type of icon. So these are obviously the white black icon. If I had the light theme or a lighter theme, it would be the color ones. And I have the ability to change that to my heart's content. So that's one really, really cool thing that I bet not a lot of folks are aware of GitHub. So also, one thing that I love about GitHub specifically is the opportunities to play around with new features. So like I mentioned, GitHub is a complete developer ecosystem. And one of the things that you can do if you want to play around some of the new features that exist with GitHub is you can open up your GitHub profile and go to feature preview. And that's going to show you all of the new things that are coming out, like things like command palette, project migration, /command, so on and so forth. Like command palette, for instance, like if you hit Shift Control P, oops, wrong thing, Shift Control P. I'm hitting the wrong thing, Shift P. My printer thing is coming up. But anyway, so you have access to something like command palette, which is something like this, where you can actually type in particular things that will allow you to hop between things like jumping into repositories, jumping into projects, packages, so on and so forth. So that's something that's really, really cool that exists in GitHub that I bet you didn't know about as well. Also, if you are a developer, more than likely you have to do things like manage projects. So, there are all sorts of tools out there. There's Jira, there's Azure Boards, there's all sorts of different tools in this space, but you can actually do all of your project management inside of GitHub as well. And that's using GitHub projects. So GitHub projects is really, really cool because all of the things that you have, like for instance, issues, pull requests, all these things, they're linked to, you can link them directly in your project. So for instance, I have a simple Kanban board that I created where I can go through and showcase some of the really, really cool things that you can do in GitHub. So like talk about the GitHub CLI, and I can actually assign these to particular sprints. I can change the view of these. I can change it from board to a table, or even go to a roadmap view and assign things to folks. And I have all sorts of different charts and opportunities to do fun things. So I'm not going to go into great detail about what projects does because there's tons of great content out there, especially created by the folks at GitHub, to show you some of the cool things that you can do with projects. But I bet you didn't know that you can do some really, really cool things with a project specifically. Another thing that I love is I'm a developer and I love building things in the command line. One of the things that you might not have been aware of is you can interact with GitHub through the command line using the GitHub CLI. So, and all I have to do is just do GitHub help. And I just have the GitHub CLI installed, and I can take a look. And these are all of the core commands and different things that I can do inside of inside of the command line. So if I can do something like GitHub issues list, for instance, this will show me all the available commands that exist for GH. So if I go like GH issue list, it's going to say no open issues in this particular thing. But however, if I go to a project that I know for a fact, let me just hop out of here. I know for a fact that there are particular issues here, I can actually use the GitHub CLI to give me a list of issues. So that's really, really cool as well. And if I don't like the command line, for instance, if I want to use a user interface, but I don't want to be on the web, I can take advantage of GitHub Desktop. So GitHub Desktop allows you to do really, really cool things like interact with your repositories that you have locally that are connected to GitHub directly. And one cool thing that I love to do in this particular case is maybe somebody was a pull request for my projects. I can actually check out that branch inside using GitHub Desktop and be able to test there in my own environment without having to go through the hoops of like figuring out what GitHub which git command I need to use, what git bash command I need to use, or download the particular pull request, like just download it and open it up through there. Like this gives you the flexibility as a developer to really play around with some of the great things that are available through GitHub. So those are some of the tools that exist for GitHub that I think are really, really interesting. And there's all sorts of other really, really interesting things too. But one of the things I love to show folks is, so let's say, for instance, that I have a list of things that I need to do as a part of my day. Right. So more than likely you've created issues in other GitHub repositories and done that sort of stuff. But you can really, if you have your own set of projects that you're managing, you can do some really, really interesting stuff as well as it pertains to issue templates. So issue templates are basically, it's a markdown provided way for you to define what your issues are. So for instance, in this particular repo I have, let's just create a new issue. And when I create a new issue, I'm given this little interface here. So do I want to submit a bug report? I want to submit a feature request. And I can extend this any way I want. If I click bug report, for instance, it'll ask me actually particular things that I need to do. So if I go to preview here, I can look at what it's actually going to look like. And I can continue and do interesting things. And one of the things that's also really, really cool about GitHub issues is that you can do things like specify checkboxes. Like for instance, in this particular case, if you have, brackets inside of Markdown, they will turn into checkboxes. I bet you didn't know that either. So there's some really, really cool things that you can do with issues as well. And one of the things that I love specifically about GitHub.com specifically is there are a handful of ways that I can interact with these particular repositories. Like for instance, there are tons of extensions that exist for the browsers, like for Chrome or for Edge or for Firefox, that allow you to do cool things. Like I have a handful of them installed here. Like for instance, GitHub is wide for me in this particular case. So I have the GitHub wide extension. I have this additional extension that allows me to download individual files, which isn't included by GitHub by default. But there is one cool browser feature that exists with GitHub that makes my life easier every day. And that's called GitHub.dev. So if I just hit dot in any repository, doesn't have to be a repository that I own, it could be any repository, period. It takes me to a visual code like experience inside of the browser where I can actually edit files. For instance, in this particular case, let's just do something silly here. So I'm in my README file. I'm just going to go, hello, Virginia friends, right? And then I have, if I click away from this file, I have the ability to commit and push this. So let's just say updates here. And then if I commit and push this, I can then go back to the repository and that change is made right there. So it's really, really cool that you can actually do a small amount of editing for your GitHub projects inside the browser directly. But in the situation where maybe you are a .NET developer like I am, or maybe some of you are, and you'll notice really quickly that if I go back into this particular thing, I don't have like the ability, for instance, to create a terminal. It says continue working in GitHub Codespaces. So what is GitHub Codespaces specifically? A GitHub Codespace is an interactive environment that's in the cloud that allows you to have a full development experience. So let's just click on continue working in GitHub Codespaces here and see what happens. So once I click that, it asks me, what kind of instance type do I want? Like how much power do I want my particular container that's running to have? I click on the smallest one because in this particular case, I don't need anything large. And GitHub will start to create a code space for me, which again is an interactive environment that I can actually use to do all sorts of interesting things. And once it's done, as you can see here, I have all of my code that I had here for this particular project. And I have all of the things that you would expect as a developer using Visual Studio Code. I can then also, if I wanted to, I can open Visual Studio Code on my own machine and connect to a code space. So for instance, if I click on connect to code space, it's going to say, okay, do you want to sign in? Because I lost auth at some point today. But then I have the ability to take a look at some of the different code spaces that I've opened. And then exact same experience. This is Visual Studio Code running on my own machine. So I'm actually not having to bear any of the performance or any of the specifications of running all of those things on my machine. All I have to do is do them in using Visual Studio Code Connect to a code space. All of the compute, all of that exercise gets done in the back end of code spaces, and then just the UI that's for me. Right, so that's pretty cool. So let's minimize this really quick and go back to this particular code space. What's really, really cool is that, again, this is a full level environment. So I can do things like uname, for instance. So uname is the way that we specify it's the Linux command for tell me more about the operating system. So if I do that, this key binding is not going to work. There we go. So as you can see here, this is a Linux code space and it's Ubuntu and it's that particular version of Azure, right? So that's really, really cool as well. So let me just hop out of there. So let's just do a couple of interesting things with GitHub Codespaces. Like, so for instance, we're .NET developers, right? So maybe we want to build and test a .NET app in GitHub Codespaces. Well, I can do that here. So I can do like .NET new. And let's just create like a new Blazor server project, right? And let's just do output. And let's just call it Blazor, right? So what I want to be able to do here is I want to create a new project. I want to maybe make some modifications to it. I want to run it, test it, build it all in this environment, right? So really, really cool stuff. So when I did that over here on the left-hand side, it created that project for me. So if I CC into this, I can do like a .NET build. And this is going to run the .NET CLI to actually build out that particular project. So as you can see, a bin directory shows up, an objects directory shows up. But what's even cooler is I can do .NET run here. And .NET Run is actually going to allow me to run this application inside of a code space and still be able to test it on my own environment. So as you can see here, I have some ports. So I have localhost 5006. So I can actually click that. But then wait, it says your application is running on port 5006 available. And I can see all forwarded ports. And I can take a look at that. So let's actually open that in a browser and see what that looks like. So connecting to our forwarded port. This is an application that's currently running inside of a code space, but I have the full developer experience, right? So if I hop back over here, I can do something as crazy as, let's just go to our counter class or a counter raiser, and I can actually set a breakpoint here. So if I do go back here, do that, I probably need to not be running, I need to be debugging it. So let's actually do that really quick. So let's close out of this. And then let's actually go to debugging and run and debug. Specify that as .NET 5 or plus or .NET Core, and then run debug here. Hopefully this actually works. I don't know what's going on there. Create a launch JSON file. There we go. So you're going to run this. And then again, I'm going to go back to that counter Razor file. And then it's going to build. It's going to run in a debugging environment. And then I'm going to get that similar experience that I had earlier where it's like, hey, you have a forwarded port open. Do you want to connect to it? So now, as you can see, I have that forwarded port. I can actually pop open that up in the browser. So as you can see here, it's a invalid certificate because it's pointing to localhost. I can click unset. And then I'm clicking too many things at once because that's what I do. And then if I can have this guy here, specify that, local address, follow the link. There we go. I'm clicking on the wrong links probably. Looking for the link that's actually going to work for me. Connecting to forwarded port. Is this the right link? Who knows? It's taking too long, so probably not. So let's do something like this. That's a bad gateway. Let's try this final one. There we go. This is the right one. So if we have a counter here, if I click me, nothing's happening because it's firing a breakpoint here. So I'm actually in a code space. So none of this is running on my machine. It's running out in the cloud. But I have breakpoints. I have watch window. I can specify like what's the value of current count. It'll tell me it's 0, right? So that, and you see current count is up and going, right? So if I click current count again, current count is still 3, so on and so forth. You get the point, right? But what's really, really cool about this is that what if I wanted to share this debugging experience with somebody? Like for instance, hey, Isaac, can you test this out for me? Well, sure you can. So I'm going to go to a particular port that I have here, and I'm going to right click, and I'm going to set the port visibility here to public. So what does that actually mean? It means that now if I don't know what that says, bad gateway. That's weird. Let's do this. Let's get rid of all of these. Stop that. Let's just delete these. Start over. All right, let's click that. And then it's going to specify that port again in 1 second after this terminal runs. So we have our application running. And eventually open the browser. Okay, there we go. Make sure this still works. Yep. So if I go to our ports tab, I have the forward port. I have a couple of different ports here, right? So I have 5006 and I have 7258. I can make 7258, for instance, a public port. So then I have the ability, hopefully, I don't know why this isn't working today. That's interesting. Let's just open up this one. Port visibility. Let's open this one up. Still no. Weird. All right. This was working literally earlier today. But anyway, these sort of things happen. So, but what it would theoretically give the ability to do is specify a particular URL and give it to another person. So I can literally throw that into the chat and say, hey, you know, folks want to try this out. But for some reason, the port forwarding isn't happening the way I really want it to, which is a bummer, but I could probably play around with it, figure out what's going on. It's probably something I did when I was configuring this, but it doesn't matter because we can go about our merry way. And I think one of the great things is really cool about CodeSpace is it allows you to have this full developer experience either in the browser, or if you like using VS Code, you can use VS Code as well. And what's also really cool about this new concept of how we build applications, whether you're doing it in VS Code or you're doing it in CodeSpace or what have you, is you have the ability to configure your developer environments a particular way you want. So for instance, when I open up a CodeSpace, I have a bunch of extensions already installed, right? And maybe I have a set of extensions that we need as a development team to make sure that works for our particular thing. And how we can do that is by using what's called a dev container. So if I bring up the command palette, I can actually go dev container, and CodeSpace's add dev container configuration file, and I can modify our active configuration. So we've noticed change to that. We're going to rebuild now, but then you can specify rebuild what sort of things. Oh, it's going to ask me to set up my CodeSpace again because I updated the dev container. But what dev container JSON does is think of it as like a environment configuration file for your development experience. So it allows you to specify, maybe I want these extensions. Maybe I want the font to be this particular size. Maybe I always want it to be dark theme. Maybe there are particular linters or other particular things that I need to have to make sure that our application is working. And you can do all of that using dev containers. So let's just go back here, add dev container JSON. Let's create a new configuration and let's continue. And you can specify like all these different definitions. So for instance, you can have a .NET one. So let's just do .NET 7. And there are some features that you can add for here. You can specify different CLIs. For instance, let's just make sure that we have .NET CLI installed here, right? And let's just click OK. And then let's just keep the defaults. And then it's going to add that dev container. So let's just actually overwrite that existing one. And then it looks like this. So it's a JSON file, like I mentioned, but then you can specify all those things I talked about a bit earlier. You can specify the base image of your dev container. You can open up these ports, and you can do all sorts of really, really interesting configurations. And there's really, really great content out there. If you literally go to YouTube or even to Google and say dev container, there's all sorts of really, really cool samples that exist that are owned by Microsoft or other entities to basically make sure that it always works regardless of whose machine it's running on. So that's a really, really cool thing as well. And one thing that I also think is really, really cool specifically about Visual Studio Code, as we hop over here, is that let's just dismiss this. Reload window. Is this going to connect again? Yep, it's going to set up a time to remote configure. We can actually, using some of the great extensions that are provided by GitHub, do interesting things. So let's actually just close out of this folder, and let's just open a folder that I have on my machine. So I'm no longer, I don't want to keep on connecting to this code space. I don't know why it's letting me do that. Let's just close Visual Studio Code. Let's just open up a new one, new window. And let's open up a project that has, for instance, some GitHub stuff in it. So let's just go to this temp folder and this Blazor GitHub pages thing here. So I have this this is a .NET application, .NET Blazor application, WebAssembly specifically. For instance, I could run this and it'll deploy like GitHub pages, for instance. So when I open this particular project, all of the GitHub extensions that I have light up and say, hey, let's play around with some of these cool things. Like one of the cool things is GitHub Actions. So GitHub Actions, if you're not familiar, and we can take a look at what GitHub Actions are in a second, I can take a look at all my GitHub Actions, but they're allowing me to do CI/CD from right within GitHub. So for instance, in this particular case, let's just hop up here and go to that particular repository that I just showed you. I'm flying all over the place. So if anybody has any questions or wants me to slow down, I'm looking at the chat as well. I want to make sure that everybody's following along because I do like to show as much stuff as possible with these particular things. So I have this Blazor GitHub Pages project, right? And inside of here, like I mentioned, it's just a typical .NET Blazor project, but I can actually deploy to GitHub Actions. To GitHub Pages, sorry. And what GitHub Pages is it's a static hosting, free static hosting service inside of GitHub. So for instance, whenever I make changes to this code, GitHub Action is fired. And what's actually in that GitHub Action? It is a list of particular steps to build and publish my application. So for instance, I'm doing a setup.NET. So I'm installing .NET on this particular agent. They're called runners in the GitHub world. I'm building it and then I'm publishing it to GitHub Pages. This isn't really important. What I think is really, really cool is that once I actually am deployed to a GitHub page, I can actually go to GitHub Pages and click View Deployment. And this is a .NET app that's running completely in the browser, right? It's not running on the code. It's not running on a server because for GitHub Pages, there is no server. Right. So that's really, really cool. And GitHub Actions allows you to do that exact thing. And you can do things like, publishing things to NuGet or publishing things out to Docker Hub from a container standpoint, publish to Azure, publish to other clouds, publish to literally anywhere you want. So GitHub Actions allows you to do that, but it's not just CI/CD, it's actually workflow, right? So one of the things, for instance, whenever I publish a new blog, right? So blog isn't the right one. So let's just go to the copy and open source repository. So I have this project called Copy and Open Source, which is basically the website for my podcast. So whenever a new podcast is staged, I do it. And what that commit actually does is it publishes a few things, but then also it does things like it sends a tweet out, it posts to Mastodon, it does all sorts of cool things. So it's not just CI/CD. You can do like whenever a new PR gets created, do some tasks. Whenever a new issue gets created, do some tasks. Whenever a label gets set on any object in GitHub, do a particular task, right? So that's some really, really cool stuff that you can do with GitHub Actions. And like I mentioned, GitHub Actions also allows you to do things like artifacts, so containers or NuGet packages and things like that. So there's some really, really cool stuff that you can do with GitHub Actions. All right. So let's move to the idea of security, right? So when we're building applications, especially in GitHub, there's always a risk that we're either consuming packages, we're dependent on packages, or that are unsafe, or we actually do things ourselves that might be unsafe. And GitHub allows us to be a bit more secure in that regard. Let me just refresh this page. Refresh this page so it's black. So I've created a project called GitHub Security Demos, which walks us through a handful of things that GitHub Security, GitHub Advanced Security specifically does for us to make our lives better as developers in general. So for instance, if I go in here to settings, not into settings, if I go to here, those three little dots, and I click on the security tab, it'll allow me to do things like define security policies, set up Dependabot, which is dependency management, basically check to see if dependencies have vulnerabilities, do things like code scanning, like secret scanning. And I've had this running for a little bit. As you can see, I have a couple of vulnerability alerts, like for instance, Dependabot. So Dependabot, which again is dependency management, it'll actually look at all of the projects that I'm referencing in my packages, and it'll say, hey, like this has this particular issue, this has this particular issue, and so on and so forth. And then it'll actually open up a pull request to mitigate, to upgrade you to the latest version. So that's Dependabot, and that's really cool. Another cool thing that it does is code scanning. So for instance, in this particular case, like if you're doing something that is not a best practice, something that can be potentially dangerous, like in this particular case, arbitrary file write during the zip extraction, that's something that is not something that you should be doing in a lot of cases, right? So you actually have a warning here, and it actually clicks on it, and it'll tell you why, and it'll show you the exact line of code that you might have to mitigate. And then finally, I've been guilty of it. I imagine some of you as well. Like I've accidentally checked connection strings, other secrets into source code. And one thing that's really, really cool about GitHub Advanced Security is that you could potentially not have that problem happen. So GitHub is, when you do commits, it is actually looking at your source code and saying, hey, this particular secret should not be in source code. So it can either do one of two things. It'll reject the commit and won't let you commit it at all, or it'll give you a warning. Like for instance, in this particular case, I have a GitHub Pat personal access token that I tried to commit 2 months ago, for instance. And this basically shows you like the potential remediation steps to resolve that particular thing, because I had it in my app settings.json. Right. So there's some really cool things that we can do to make our lives better as developers by using some of the built-in security features of GitHub. All right. I'm going to pause for a second because I've been talking nonstop for like 35 minutes. Did anybody have any questions? Feel free to throw them into the chat, raise your hand, I'll take a look. Otherwise, I'll just keep marching on because we're going to talk about some of the newer functionality that's been brought to GitHub in the last few months that we can use to really do some cool stuff. I'm going to take silence with everybody is bored and they're just waiting to go to dinner. How's that sound?
No, just blown away.
All right.
Any of this stuff have a cost, Isaac, or is this?
Nope. So things like Codespace is available for free on public projects. GitHub.dev is completely free. Like I mentioned, like I can go to, like for instance, let's go to github.com/.net ASP.NET Core. So I don't own the ASP.NET Core repo. I am not in the .NET organization. I can still GitHub dot and open it up in github.dev. If I try to make an edit to a file, it's not going to let me. But I have like a fully validated, fully searchable instance of this particular GitHub repository in the browser, right? So that's completely free. Everything I've shown to this extent is free. I haven't shown anything yet that costs money. There are some things with GitHub Advanced Security that do cost money, but I didn't show any of them. If you have a free project, you should be able to access all these things.
That's pretty amazing.
All right.
Yeah, kind of on that same subject, I noticed when, I think it was at the very beginning when you were starting up your code space, it asked you the size of the machine that you were going to use. It seems like, was there some limit there as to how many cores you can use or something? Is it or for some period of time?
Yeah, so with GitHub Code Spaces, you get, I'm just going to get you the exact number because I'm not going to give it to you and lie. So if you go to GitHub Code Spaces, I believe plans and pricing, so get up to 60 hours of free each month, right? So it goes through and it tells you like the different cores. So it's obviously based on compute. So if you have the 2-core version that I had, for instance, I get 60 hours of that for free. If it's 4 cores, it's half, and so on and so forth. And then for storage, you get 16 gigs of storage for free. So again, like this is free like beer, not free like you have to pay in the future. But obviously, if you need to go above that, you have the ability to do that, or you can take advantage of some of the GitHub Enterprise functionality or GitHub Enterprise SKUs that allow you to get that extra level if you want to roll this out for an entire team, for instance.
Cool. Oh, great. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Sweet. We talked about GitHub Actions really, really quickly. And one of the things that I think is very interesting about GitHub Actions, where am I? Here we go. One thing that I love about GitHub Actions is that, you can iterate and build really, really interesting things. And, it's a full-blown CI/CD mechanism. Like, for instance, if I go to this workflow file here, it defines everything, right? So in this particular case, I'm setting up .NET. So I'm installing the preview of .NET 8 on this particular environment to run, and then I'm doing a .NET build and all that sort of stuff. When I want to make changes to this, maybe I don't want to make those changes and publish them out to GitHub right away. Maybe I want to run them in my own environment or test them out in my own environment. Well, you can actually do that with a free tool that's not created by GitHub called ACT. So actually, let's take a look at what that looks like. So I'm in WSL. So somebody mentioned my command line earlier. So I'm using Microsoft Windows Terminal. I have a bunch of different profiles, as you can see here, depending on what environments I'm in. And then if I'm in PowerShell, for instance, I use OhmyPosh. So there's tons of content around that. Scott Hansman has some great stuff if you want to take a look at that. I'm in a project right now, and I'm going to open this up in WSL, which is Windows Subsystem for Linux, which is basically Ubuntu that's running inside on my Windows machine. I'm in this particular project here that I showed earlier, like GitHub Pages project, and I have ACT installed. So ACT, I just pull up ACT while that's loading, is a mechanism that allows you to run your GitHub Actions locally. So, and this is a free project, and there's tons of documentation around it. But if I go and I just open this up and I do like ACT-L, which is list, it'll list out the particular GitHub Actions that I have on my machine. And then I could do like ACT-N, which is for dry run, which means, hey, I want to test to make sure that this is a valid action and it's going to do the things I want to do. And I click N here, and I click enter, and it's going to go through the process of actually running that GitHub action on my machine, and it'll make sure that it's success or not. So for instance, it's going to set up .NET, it's going to publish, it's going to do all those things. So it validates whether my action is complete or not, and then it tells me that the job has succeeded. So you don't have to actually continually iterate on publishing or contributing new GitHub actions. You have the ability to do that yourself. One thing is also really, really cool about GitHub Actions specifically is that they are community driven. So you can like go to the GitHub Actions marketplace and you can take a look and it'll show you that there's over 18,000 actions that have been created by the developer community. And some of them are pretty well known. Like you can let's just sort by most installed, for instance, and, GitHub checkout and caching and deploying to GitHub pages and publishing to Docker and things like that. But then you can also do interesting other things like Windows Store, right? We were talking a little bit earlier about the Windows Store. And coincidentally enough, there is a GitHub action that allows you to publish to the Windows Store. And I don't know who that guy is who wrote that. We should probably not trust anything that he builds. But again, it allows you to do all sorts of things. And you can take a look and it'll show you when you click on them, like how you actually add these to your particular workflow. And again, because GitHub Actions are open source, they're just projects. They're configured to run as particular workflows. So that's something that's really, really cool. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to start closing a lot of these tabs because I have way too many tabs open. I tend to do this when I do this talk. So I'm going to close out some tabs here. And the security one, we don't need that one anymore. We don't need projects. We don't need this one, but we don't need that one either. Let's leave that one open. And let's just keep our code spaces open. So what else can we talk about? Maybe let's talk a little bit about AI, right? When we think about artificial intelligence, we think about like all of the terrible things that can happen or all the crazy things that you can do, ChatGPT and so on and so forth, right? But there are some really cool things that you can do with GitHub Copilot, which is the AI assistant tool here. Let's actually open up VS Code locally. And if I open up my list of extensions here, let's just open that up. If I scroll down, I have a whole bunch of GitHub extensions for just GitHub Actions and GitHub Codespaces, but then I also have these GitHub Copilot ones. So let's actually take a look at some of the cool things that we could do with GitHub Copilot. So let's actually hop over here and let's just open up this particular program.cs. And like, what if I don't know what some of this code does? Like, what does add scopes mean? I don't know what that means. But because I have GitHub Copilot, I can actually go over here and I can have GitHub Copilot Labs and I can actually explain what that code does. So let's explain what this code is. Explain code, I can transfer it to Python. Let me just zoom out a little bit so this is more readable. But I can do things like ask Copilot what that code does. If I ask Copilot what this code does, what do you think it's going to tell me? It's going to say, here's an explanation of the code above. The builder project is a type of WebAssembly host builder, right? So again, this is a simple example, but let's do something that's a bit more complex. Let's go over to our fetch data here. And this isn't a great example either, but let's actually just highlight all of this text. We're going to go to GitHub Copilot Labs, and it'll say, explain what that code does. So it'll actually take a look at this code, and it'll actually tell us what it's doing. And this is really, really valuable if you have like some very large code bases and maybe some code bases that you haven't touched before. So here's the explanation of this. It basically walks through step by step of all the things that it's doing. So for instance, let's do this right here. So maybe I want to make a small change to this particular project, and I can actually have chat, GitHub Copilot chat, which is something that just came out recently. It's still, I believe it's still in private preview. If anybody wants to know how to get access to it, you can. But you can actually ask it questions similar to ChatGPT. So let's just do this. So I use Copilot Labs, but like maybe I want to say like, can you explain? Oops. Let's do this. Let's highlight this code as I'm frantically just typing up. Let's just copy here. So I'm highlighting that code. Explain the selected code. And let's see what GitHub Copilot tells us. This is going to tell us that it's taking a date object and it's translating it to a short date string. Hopefully this actually comes back. This is obviously stuff that's in beta, so sometimes it doesn't work the exact way we want it. Well, let's just do this. Do short date string. What does? Oh, there we go. So select the code as part of a razor component. The forecast object is assumed to be of a type that has a date property. The toShort date string method is called on the date property. So that's awesome. It told us exactly what we want to do. However, maybe somebody said, hey, Isaac, like toShort date string isn't going to work for us. Like, can you have it be in a different format? Like, for instance, like an actual fully fledged date. So I could say, how could I format it to be like June 1, 2023. And if I enter here, GitHub Copilot is actually going to tell me the actual string formatter to actually modify that. So this is, if folks don't know their date formatting, this is going to have like the full month and then the single day and then the full year. So GitHub Copilot, especially GitHub Copilot Chat, or I think they call it GitHub Copilot X technically, it allows us to have a pair programmer next to us at all times that not only can help us define code, it can also recommend code for us in particular cases. It'll ask us additional questions based on context, right? And it just continues to do really, really crazy and really, really cool stuff. And I love GitHub Copilot because it allowed me as a developer to not get stuck, like not have to go out to Stack Overflow and search mindlessly for things. But this is in the world of code. What if, let's just minimize all of this and let's just close that. What if I wanted to do this at the command line as well? So like, I don't know about you, but I always forget like command line commands to do particular things, right? So for instance, like, oh, like how do I, add a package using AppX or something like that? Well, GitHub Copilot also has a CLI. So you can actually do something like question mark, and then let's just add something like show system information. So this will actually create a Copilot request, and it'll say, get computer info is a PowerShell command that returns information about the current computer. I can actually run this command. Sure. And then it will run that particular command. So no longer are we forced to have to go out and figure out even commands for the command line either. We can actually do it whether you're in PowerShell, whether you're in Ubuntu, or you're in the Linux world, in Bash, you have the ability to do all those things. And what if there's also some other things like that's just like for simple, like for instance, like system level commands. But like, what if there's Git stuff that I don't know, like Git list last 5 commits, because I don't know Git at all, but GitHub Copilot does. GitHub Copilot will say, okay, git log 5. I can run this particular thing, and again, it shows me all of the last 5 commits particular thing. And like, what if I don't know the GitHub CLI? So I can do GitHub dev list all issues, because maybe I'm new to the GitHub CLI. And then it shows GH issue list -L 1000. And I can get, again, all of the issues that exist for this particular thing. So GitHub Copilot allows us to do a handful of things, whether we're in code, whether on the command line, whether we're just trying to figure out things. And I'm really excited about some of the things that are coming out of GitHub Copilot, and I hope you are as well. So with that, let's actually hop back up to my browser, because I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. Everything's in the browser, right? And I'm going to end you with this. So I've been talking for about 45 minutes or so, and I want to leave some time for some questions. So if anybody wants to learn more about any of the stuff that I just showed you, this QR code here will take you to a list of all sorts of links that I've curated for this particular talk. And again, like, I want folks to get the most out of GitHub, and hopefully you learned some things today that you didn't know. So again, I'd love to chat a little bit. Like, we have a bit of a smaller group here, so I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions and whatnot. So thanks for listening to me chat nonstop for 45 minutes. I hope you enjoyed it.
Yep. Thank you, Isaac.
Sure.
Appreciate you showing this off. I do have a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Can you show us exactly what we need to do to install, like, GitHub Copilot? I know there's like a few different extensions in there and whatnot. Like, can you show us what to do? Like, what would you have to do?
So if you want GitHub Copilot, so for instance, and you're a Visual Studio Code developer, also GitHub Copilot is available in Visual Studio, and I can show that as well if you want. So let's just do this. So if I go to my extensions window and just search for Copilot, there are a handful of different projects that exist. There's GitHub Copilot, which is the typical like pair programmer where it'll like show you, like you can provide a comment and it'll show you, and it'll just insert blocks of code into your editor. Basically, it's a code recommendation tool. That is available today. You don't need to sign up for anything. GitHub Copilot Nightly is what I have access to, because I have access to the GitHub Copilot X experience. So that is the like the what does my code do, like that chat-like experience that we have here. And if anybody wants to get access to that, where is my browser window? If you go to GitHub Copilot chat preview, and if you go to the introducing GitHub Copilot X like landing page, there is a sign up for technical preview. So this already says I'm in because I'm in, but this is where you can join the waitlist. And I believe after build, which was last week, I believe they're letting everybody in now. Don't quote me on that. There probably will be some time. There'll be some delay. I've heard there's hundreds of thousands of people in the wait list. So, but if it's something that you want to play around with, I highly recommend doing it. And what's also really cool about GitHub is that there are all sorts of other cool projects that are going on. So if you go to GitHub VNext.com, GitHubNext.com, it'll list out all of the projects that are currently being built out by the team at GitHub. So like Copilot for CLI, which is something that I showed, Copilot for Docs, which is currently being worked on, Copilot Voice, and you can sign up if there are waitlists for them. You can join the waitlist and play around with some of these things. So this is what I do. Like I just go in and I play around with stuff, and every now and then I get to see something that's really, really exciting. So GitHubNext.com is the website for that. So that's kind of how you get access to a lot of the stuff. Like again, if you're in Visual Studio, same thing, go to Visual Studio extensions, search for Copilot and install what you have. The caveat being obviously is that you need a GitHub account. And in some situations with Copilot, you will need like GitHub Pro, but there are some, that's well documented if you go and take a look at some of the information around GitHub Copilot. I did see that somebody asked me like how to set up a GitHub profile in Windows Terminal. Not 100% sure what you mean there, Joe. Do you want to maybe come off of mute and explain to me kind of what you're looking for?
Yeah,
you don't have to if you don't want.
Mute button there. Yeah, just right there is what I was talking about, how you're doing some of the GitHub commands inside that the different tabs of Windows Terminal. I thought you said you'd created a profile specifically for your GitHubs there from the drop down.
No, I have a profile for a bunch of different developer command lines. So I have one for PowerShell, one for the command prompt if I ever need to do the command prompt. I have one for Ubuntu. I have a media server at my house that I SSH into. So this is a profile that allows me to do that. Azure Cloud Shell if I want to be able to interact with my resources in Azure from the command line. And I can manage all these things in Terminal using like their settings interface. So this is what I was talking about for that. But if you want like this sort of thing where you get like some cool little glyphs and that's Oh My Posh. So if you search for Oh My Posh, this will take you to Jan Dev Doblers, who is the creator of Oh My Posh. And one of the things really, really awesome about Oh My Posh is that it's an open source project as well that allows you to completely customize your shell experience. So, and there's like, Jan's put together like tons of really, really good documentation on it, depending on what environments you have, the different customization options you have, and how you build out an experience that you want. Like, so for instance, like maybe you, let's just scroll down here. Oops, click the wrong button too fast, configuration, oops, segments. My mouse is hopping all over the place. Maybe you want to have like something related to the Azure portal. You figure out like what Azure environment you have. So in this particular case, you can specify this particular configuration. It'll show you like the environment name for your Azure resources. Again, this is like there are tons and tons of customizations with like terminal experiences. Like I mentioned, Scott Hanselman has some really good content around that. Kayla Cinnamon, who used to be the PM for Windows Terminal, she's now the PM for a different product in Windows. She has a lot of great content on it. And then Jan, for instance, as well, like has a lot of content around Oh My Posh and PowerShell extensibility. So definitely take a look at that if you want to learn more.
Cool. That's what I was looking for. Thanks.
Yeah. So Henry asks, for code spaces, can you configure the tech stack? Or are you limited to normal stacks such as .NET or Node? Not 100% following what you're asking. Maybe you want to hop off and we can take a look at maybe an example of what you're trying to do.
I was just wondering if it was, it seemed like, for example, when you went in there to create the Blazor app, you immediately had access to the .NET command line tool, for example. Yep. And I was wondering whether if you were creating a Go project or a Python project, does it also support that, or do you have to do something to configure the dev tools that you're going to use?
So in GitHub Codespaces, there are a list of pre-installed software, and I will get that for you right now. So basically, there is a lot of stuff that's basically pre-built on the box for GitHub Codespaces. So like, I believe Go is in there. I believe like Node is in there. I believe Ruby is in there. Let's see if I can find out, give you an exact answer. What languages are pre-installed on GitHub? GothHub, GitHub Code Spaces. It's not going to easily show me, unfortunately. There is like in somewhere in these docs, it tells you exactly what is on a code space. Deep dive into code spaces. Let's just try this. Let's say .NET. Let's search for .NET.
I could probably find it. I just thought it was
yeah. But at the end of the day,
remarkable that you didn't have to install anything. It was already there when you got ready to run .NET build or .NET restore.
Yeah, like so for instance, like I know Python is on here. So if I go Python version, Python -- version, it'll show you that, like npm version. So like there are tons of pre-installed tools on here. And like, for instance, like there's Azure CLI. So AZ version. I don't have Azure CLI anymore. I thought it did. Azure, maybe it doesn't. I thought it definitely probably does. I'm probably just doing something wrong. But there are a ton of pre-configured tools. And if you need to install tools, you can using that dev container.json. And again, because it's similar to VS Code from a developer experience perspective, like you can install like all sorts of extensions also. So like, I don't know what's going on here. I must have disconnected from it on accident. But like you can go in and you can install extensions. Like for instance, like maybe I need to do something with CMake, for instance. Like I can, get all that language support built in for CMake, and that will install particular things as well needed for CMake. And that's it. And that's just a random extension, right? But again, there are tons of tools that are pre-installed on these code spaces. But in a situation where maybe you have like some weird software that you need, you can actually, if your organization decides to move forward with code spaces, like as a developer environment, you can actually host your own runners and provide your own image for the runners that has all of your pre-configured software already on them. So yeah, hope that answers your question, but definitely take a look at the docs if you want to get a better understanding of what exactly is on them.
Yeah, it does. It really looks remarkable because you think about when you onboard a new developer to a project, how long it takes to get somebody up to speed just to build a development environment. It's going to be really interesting to go out to something like this and be able to immediately go to work.
Yeah, and I mean, so I believe so. I think so. GitHub actually builds GitHub.com using GitHub Codespaces, and I believe that like I saw some information like to onboard a new developer, it takes a minute. To onboard a new GitHub.com developer, it takes about a minute because they have a pre-configured code space that literally you just create a new code space with that repository and it builds all the stuff for you and you have access to all the tools you need. So imagine going from it taking like a week as a developer to get on board to a new project to like less than a minute, which is pretty crazy. So yeah, GitHub Codespaces is an absolute game changer. I mean, if you have the opportunity to play around with it, like again, it's free for 60 hours a month, which is a lot. Like, I mean, it is a lot. Like unless you're trying to use it daily, if you want to use it for like a couple hours a week, it's substantially, worth it in my opinion. All right. I'm going to take a look at the chat. So it looks like I have the GitHub Copilot extensions. How did you do the CLI help with like the question mark? So that is something that's available via that public or that technical preview. So there is a project. So where's GitHub V next? So there's a project called GitHub Copilot for CLI. So you can actually sign up for the waitlist there for that if you want. This is going to say, oh, you've already signed up. Oh, look, so that's exciting. So if you want access to the waitlist for that, you can definitely do that there. So this basically just provides, like I mentioned, shell commands for Git specifically, GitHub CLI specifically, and then system. With all this stuff, more than likely, it's you got to sign up for a waitlist or go to github.com and figure out how to get access to it. All right. Anything else?
Which one was the one that you were asking questions about your code? You were typing in specific questions. What extension or what feature was that?
That was GitHub Copilot X. So that is, I don't even know if it's on this page anymore. GitHub Copilot, but if you search for GitHub Copilot X, that's where you sign up for the preview for that. So GitHub Copilot X, it's kind of like a blanket term for a handful of different features. One of them being the Visual Studio experience, which I didn't even show. There's a Visual Studio experience for it. And then that VS Code experience, where you get like this thing here, this little chat window.
So I went over there and I had signed up for this like 2 months ago. It says you are in. What do you do then?
So you have to install the GitHub extension. So you should have gotten an email when you were let in. And basically, if you need to install this GitHub Copilot Nightly extension.
Oh,
so,
gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Oh, cool.
Or, I'm sorry, not GitHub Copilot Nightly, GitHub Copilot Chat, which is a specific one. So it'll say, GitHub Copilot Chat will only work when all these requirements are met using VS Code Insiders. That's important. The GitHub Copilot Nightly must install alongside Copilot Chat, and your GitHub account is signed into VS Code, and you must have an active GitHub Copilot subscription and must be accepted to the GitHub Copilot Chat preview. So, and that gives you a link to the waitlist.
Gotcha.
So if you're
I'm not running Insiders, but I know you can run Insiders edition side by side with the regular edition. So no harm in installing the Insiders edition, I guess, of VS Code.
Correct. Yeah. Like I honestly, like I only use the Insiders edition of VS Code. I don't know why. I just always have kind of done the Insiders of software. Like I use the Preview Visual Studio, for instance. I'm on the .NET previews. I just like playing around with new stuff before it's like fully ready for people to use it. But yeah. All right. Well, did anybody have anything else?
All right, I think that's it. Really appreciate you again, Isaac. I'm going to be playing a lot with now things that I didn't even know I had.
Yeah, that was the whole point. Hopefully you can take a look at some stuff you didn't know existed, right?
Yeah, no, this is huge. I actually didn't realize I got accepted. I must have missed that email. And I know it's easier to get in now, so everybody go sign up for the waiting lists. What was that site again?
So GitHubNext.com.
GitHubNext.com. That is awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, and I hope that if you're not using GitHub already, I highly recommend you do it. It's free, and who doesn't like free stuff? So hope everybody enjoyed the talk. And obviously, if you want to reach out to me and learn more and chat with me, you can follow me on Twitter. My handle there is Isaac R. Levin. You can find me just by searching my name. I think I'm pretty high up on the Google results.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, this was more than just GitHub. This was, GitHub and supercharging your capabilities around writing code and CLI and everything else.
Yeah, it's a lot for an hour. So I appreciate everybody's patience as we kind of hammered through a lot of topics.
Fantastic. Well, with that, I thank you. Really appreciate you coming in and showing to our group and enlightening us. Next month, remember, we do not have a meetup for July due to all the vacations and fun people are having away from home. But we will return back to face-to-face meetings on August and September. So hopefully, for those of you at least who are nearby or who can come nearby, hope to see you guys there. Thank you, everybody.